What if the pain you carry isn't just in your head, but etched into your body, your cells, your breath, and even the way you sleep? That's not just a theory, it's the reality of trauma. And the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, tears the veil off what trauma truly does to the brain, body, and soul. This groundbreaking book is not just a read, it's a revelation. Backed by decades of clinical research and first-hand experience with war veterans, abuse survivors, and everyday people silently battling invisible wounds, this book explores how trauma reshapes not only our psychology but also our biology. It lives in our posture, our hormones, our flashbacks, and even our silence. In this audiobook-style summary, you'll journey through 5 powerfully crafted sections, from understanding the roots of trauma and how it hijacks the brain, to the latest breakthroughs in healing, like EMDR, neurofeedback, yoga, and theater. You'll also uncover how trauma affects children, how memory can imprison or liberate, and how reclaiming your body is the key to freedom. If you or someone you love has ever felt stuck in past pain, this is where healing begins. Let's begin. Prologue: Facing Trauma. Trauma is everywhere. It lives not just in the obvious aftermath of war, abuse, or disaster, but also in the hidden corners of ordinary lives. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a pioneering trauma psychiatrist, reflects on his early days treating Vietnam War veterans, when he first began to see that traditional therapy couldn't fully reach the depths of their suffering. These men weren't just reliving memories, they were trapped in them. Their minds and bodies were stuck in a constant state of alert, fear, or numbness. And worse, the medical world had little understanding, or compassion, for what they endured. With empathy and scientific rigor, van der Kolk lays the foundation for the book's mission, to show that healing from trauma requires more than talk. It demands we understand the body's role in remembering and recovering. Part 1: The Rediscovery of Trauma. Chapter 1: Lessons from Vietnam Veterans. In the quiet aftermath of war, the battle often continues within. Many Vietnam veterans return to a society eager to forget the horrors of war, but they themselves were trapped, held hostage by flashbacks, nightmares, and an overwhelming sense of dread. These were men who had survived physical warfare but were undone by the mental war that followed. They couldn't sleep, couldn't trust, couldn't live without being pulled back into a moment of terror their bodies refused to forget. These veterans weren't weak. They weren't broken. They were wounded in ways that didn't show on the skin but carved deeply into their souls. Their suffering spoke of a truth that society at large was only beginning to grasp: trauma doesn't vanish when the danger ends. It lives on, in memory, in the nervous system, and in every instinctual response. What emerged from this period was a powerful insight. Trauma is not just a story from the past, it is a living presence in the body and brain. The veterans forced a reckoning, not just with war, but with the nature of trauma itself. They taught the medical and mental health community that you can't simply talk your way out of trauma. The body remembers, even when the mind tries to forget. Chapter 2: Revolutions in Understanding Mind and Brain. As the veterans' stories continued to pour in, it became clear that something more than traditional therapy was needed. For decades, mental health focused largely on cognition: what people think, how they talk, what they remember. But trauma doesn't play by those rules. People would say, "I know it's over, but I still feel like I'm there." This split between knowledge and experience revealed a critical truth: trauma lives in the body, not just in the thoughts. Scientific revolutions began to emerge. Tools like brain imaging opened a window into what trauma actually does to the brain. It turned out that traumatic memories don't behave like ordinary memories. They aren't stored with a beginning, middle, and end. Instead, they stay alive, vivid, and reactive. A sudden sound or a familiar smell can hurl a person back decades, as if no time has passed at all. Parts of the brain responsible for rational thought shut down when trauma is triggered, and more primitive, survival-driven areas light up. This explains why people who have experienced trauma often react with irrational intensity. It's not a choice, it's a brain that's been rewired for defense. One powerful case revealed how survivors can become stuck in perpetual loops of fear. A woman sexually abused as a child was terrified of intimacy. No matter how much she told herself she was safe, her body flinched and froze. Her brain didn't believe her. What she needed wasn't more reasoning. She needed to retrain her body to feel safe. The scientific discoveries here weren't merely academic. They validated what trauma survivors had long known. They weren't crazy, lazy, or weak. They were living with a nervous system that had been hijacked by past terror. Chapter 3: Looking into the Brain, the Neuroscience Revolution. In the dim glow of fMRI scans, the silent language of trauma finally began to speak. Scientists could now observe how the traumatized brain operated in real time. When shown images or sounds that hinted at their trauma, survivors' brains lit up in areas associated with fear and emotion, while those governing logic and speech went dark. This revelation was groundbreaking. It showed that trauma causes a physical shift in brain function. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for reasoning, gets overridden by the amygdala, the brain's alarm center. In effect, the trauma survivor lives in a constant state of emergency, even in the absence of actual danger. Children who grew up in violent homes often exhibited similar neurological patterns. Their developing brains were shaped not by curiosity, but by the need to survive. They were jumpy, hyper-aware, emotionally distant. They learned to scan for threats rather than connect with others. The brain adapts to its environment, and for them, danger was the environment. One of the most touching stories was of a boy who had been neglected and abused. He was adopted into a loving home, but struggled with sudden outbursts and panic. His new parents were confused. He was safe now, so why was he still afraid? The answer lay in his brain. It had been wired for threat detection, not trust. Healing required more than a new environment. It required time, patience, and methods that could speak the language of his body. This neuroscience revolution emphasized a major shift. Trauma is not all in your head. It's in your body, your cells, your muscles, and your breath. Understanding this was liberating for many. It gave them permission to seek healing that went beyond talk therapy, toward yoga, EMDR, neurofeedback, and other body-based practices that worked with the nervous system, not against it. A human story of rediscovery. This first part of the book is not just about data and diagnosis. It's about honoring the lived experience of people who've endured the unendurable. It's about recognizing that trauma doesn't go away with time. It must be faced, processed, and reintegrated into the whole self. The stories of Vietnam veterans, of abused children, and of survivors from all walks of life point to a single, powerful truth: healing is possible. But first we must listen, not just to words, but to bodies, to behaviors, to silence. We must stop asking, "What's wrong with you?" and start asking, "What happened to you?" Part 2. This is your brain on trauma. Chapter 4. Running for your life, the anatomy of survival. Imagine the moment you are nearly hit by a speeding car. Your heart races, your breath quickens, and your body jolts into action without conscious thought. That's your survival brain at work. In this chapter, we enter the world of automatic responses, the instinctive systems that keep us alive but also, when overwhelmed by trauma, trap us in cycles of fear and helplessness. The human brain has evolved over millions of years, and deep within its core lies the most primal component, the brainstem, governing automatic responses like heartbeat, breathing, and fight or flight instincts. When a threat is perceived, the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, sounds the alert, triggering the hypothalamus and brainstem to flood the body with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Blood rushes to your limbs, preparing you to flee or fight. However, trauma causes this finely tuned system to misfire. In the face of overwhelming horror, many trauma survivors freeze. Their bodies shut down rather than activate. This response, rooted in the oldest survival mechanism shared even with reptiles, can leave a person feeling powerless, ashamed, and confused. This chapter also shares the story of trauma survivors like war veterans or children who were abused, showing how their bodies became stuck in a state of constant vigilance. Their minds keep scanning for threats that no longer exist, and their bodies remain tense, ready to react. Even the sound of a slamming door or a sharp glance can reignite the internal alarms. Here are some of the true life experiences. The story of the soldier who never came home. He had survived the war, but not the peace. A veteran of the Vietnam War, he sat in van der Kolk's office years after the combat had ended. By all outward appearances, he had returned to civilian life. He had a job, a family, and a home. But inside, the war had never ended. He rarely slept through the night. The pop of a car backfiring would send him crawling under his bed before he could stop himself. His body was still at war, still living under siege. At night, he would bolt upright, drenched in sweat, gasping for air, convinced the enemy was near. "I know I'm safe," he'd say. "But I don't feel safe." He didn't talk much about what he saw over there, the smells, the screams, the friends who never came back. But his body spoke louder than words. His muscles were constantly tensed. His fists clenched unconsciously. His eyes darted around a room looking for exits. He wasn't trying to remember the war. He was trying not to relive it. No one had ever told him that his reactions were normal for someone who had experienced what he had. Instead, he was told to be strong, get over it, and move on. But trauma doesn't respond to willpower. His nervous system was still wired for survival, his body forever on high alert. He didn't lack courage. What he lacked was peace. The story of the boy who became invisible. Then there was the child. A quiet, withdrawn boy who had suffered years of abuse at the hands of those meant to protect him. By the time he entered therapy, he was just 8 years old, but his eyes looked much older. They were watchful, haunted. He barely spoke. He didn't play with other children. He flinched when someone raised their hand, even to wave. Loud noises sent him hiding in corners. He had trouble sleeping and often complained of stomach pain, though no illness could be found. The abuse he had endured had not only shattered his trust, it had rewired his entire body to expect pain and betrayal. Even in safety, he couldn't relax. His brain had learned to interpret love as danger, care as a trick. His body responded accordingly, with silence and stillness, as if trying to disappear. What hurt most was not just the bruises or the yelling, it was the loneliness. The unbearable weight of carrying invisible wounds in a world that didn't seem to notice. He wasn't acting out, he was surviving. What is the common thread? Though their stories were different, a battlefield and a broken home, the aftermath was strikingly similar. Both the veteran and the child carried trauma not in memories alone, but in their bodies. Their nervous systems had become locked in a loop of fear, hyperarousal, and shutdown. Their bodies kept reliving the danger, even when the danger was gone. These stories are not isolated. They are heartbreakingly common. They remind us that trauma is not just about what happens to someone, it's about what happens inside them as a result. And until the body feels safe again, healing remains out of reach. But as van der Kolk's work shows, there is hope. Through trauma-informed care, where the body is included, not ignored, survivors can begin to reclaim their lives. Bit by bit, they can teach their bodies that the war is over, that the danger has passed, and that peace is possible. Here, we begin to see trauma not as an event of the past, but as something etched into the nervous system. The real struggle is not just remembering the traumatic moment, but reliving its emotional and physical aftermath, again and again. Chapter 5. Body-Brain Connections. Trauma isn't just stored in memories, it is embedded in the very tissues of the body. This chapter dives deeper into the intimate dance between the brain and the body, highlighting how unresolved trauma can physically manifest in chronic pain, digestive issues, autoimmune problems, and a constant sense of disconnection. The vagus nerve, a key player in this narrative, is introduced as a critical link between the brain and internal organs. This powerful nerve affects heart rate, respiration, digestion, and even emotional regulation. When working properly, it allows us to feel calm, connected, and safe. But in those with trauma histories, the vagus nerve often becomes dysregulated. This means the body may react as if danger is ever present, even in moments of peace. For many survivors, their bodies become alien to them. They no longer feel at home within themselves. Some report numbness, others describe hypersensitivity to touch or sound. The body, once a source of comfort and joy, now feels like a battleground. Therapeutic interventions like yoga, breathing techniques, and mindfulness begin to surface here as tools not for erasing trauma, but for retraining the body to live in the present. These practices gently reintroduce the individual to bodily sensations, rebuilding trust in their own internal signals. This chapter is a powerful reminder that the body keeps the score, not metaphorically, but biologically. Trauma alters physiology, and healing must involve reconnecting with the very systems that were thrown into disarray. Chapter 6. Losing your body, losing yourself. There's something profoundly unsettling about losing the sense of your own body. In this final chapter of Part 2, the narrative turns inward, exploring the devastating psychological consequences of trauma on a person's sense of identity and selfhood. One survivor said, "It's like I'm watching life happen through a window." Another described her body as just a thing I drag around. These haunting expressions of disembodiment are common among trauma survivors. When the body no longer feels like a safe place, the mind disconnects. This separation can lead to a range of dissociative symptoms: blank spells, memory lapses, emotional numbness, and an eerie sense of unreality. Here, we learn that a fully integrated self depends on the ability to feel your emotions and your body as one. Trauma fragments that experience. It's not that people forget what happened, it's that they remember too vividly, and their bodies still react as if the trauma is ongoing. This chapter also speaks to how early childhood trauma, particularly when inflicted by caregivers, can shatter the foundation of a stable identity. A child learns who they are through the loving, consistent reflection of a parent. But if that parent is abusive or neglectful, the child may grow up without a coherent sense of self. As the chapter concludes, we begin to see a recurring message: talk therapy alone is often insufficient. Healing trauma must go beyond words. It must involve reclaiming the body, restoring its role as a safe and reliable home. Only then can the fragment itself begin to feel whole again. Closing reflections on Part 2. This Is Your Brain on Trauma isn't merely an exploration of brain science. It is a compassionate lens into the inner worlds of those who have been wounded, not just emotionally but physiologically. The chapters illuminate how trauma rewires the nervous system, how it traps survivors in cycles of reactivity, and how it robs people of their most essential human experience, the sense of being fully present in their own bodies. Yet within this darkness lies hope. Hope that the brain's plasticity allows for healing. Hope that through reconnecting with the body, via breath, movement, mindfulness, and safety, we can reweave the fabric of identity that trauma has torn apart. As we move forward, the journey deepens. Future parts of this powerful book will guide us through various therapeutic approaches that tap into the body and the mind, inviting us to believe not just in recovery, but in transformation. Part 3. The Minds of Children. Chapter 7. Getting on the Same Wavelength, Attachment and Attunement. In the quiet corners of early childhood, long before words take shape, a child's emotional foundation is being laid, not with logic, but through connection. The earliest relationships a child forms, particularly with caregivers, shape how they will come to experience themselves, others, and the world around them. This is the heart of attachment. Attachment is not simply about being fed, clothed, or kept safe. It's about being seen. It's about a parent noticing a furrowed brow, a sudden silence, a delighted laugh, and responding with empathy and understanding. This dance between parent and child, when done consistently, builds what neuroscientists call attunement, the ability of a caregiver to be emotionally in sync with their child's internal states. When that attunement is present, the child learns a crucial lesson: I matter. I am understood. I am safe. From this, a resilient and flexible sense of self begins to emerge. Their developing brain wires itself for trust, for curiosity, for connection. But what happens when that attunement is missing? Dr. Bessel van der Kolk recounts the story of James, a boy removed from his home after severe neglect. James had spent most of his first 3 years in a home where no one came when he cried. Meals were sporadic, affection rarer still. By the time he entered foster care, he didn't make eye contact, didn't respond to his name, and would rock himself to sleep in the corner of the room. His foster mother tried her best. She offered hugs, sang lullabies, and spoke to him gently, but James remained unreachable, locked in his own world. It wasn't that he didn't want connection, it was that he didn't understand it. His brain had never learned that people could be sources of comfort. In fact, other humans had become unpredictable, even threatening. This tragic outcome is not rare. Neuroscience has shown that infants whose caregivers are unresponsive or inconsistent develop stress response systems that are chronically on edge. They have difficulty regulating their emotions and struggle with impulse control later in life. These are not bad kids. They are children whose inner alarm systems were never given a chance to calm down. The chapter also explores fascinating brain imaging studies. In one experiment, children with secure attachment showed more activation in brain regions related to empathy and social interaction. Children with disorganized attachment, often the result of abuse or neglect, showed greater activity in regions associated with fear and hypervigilance. Their brains were, in effect, wired to survive, not to thrive. Dr. van der Kolk highlights that the caregiver's own history plays a major role. A mother who has never felt safe herself, who was abused or emotionally neglected, may struggle to attune to her baby's needs. She may unintentionally repeat the cycle, withdrawn, anxious, or overly intrusive, despite her best intentions. But here lies the hope: attunement can be learned. Programs that coach caregivers in noticing and responding to their children's emotional cues have shown remarkable success. Foster parents trained in these methods have been able to help even the most emotionally shut down children slowly re-engage, rebuild trust, and rewire their sense of connection. The chapter ends with an emotional truth: humans are not meant to self-regulate in isolation. From the moment we are born, our nervous systems are shaped through relationships. Trauma disrupts that process, but healing, too, comes through connection. James, over time, began to change. It took months of patience, consistency, and love, but eventually, he started to respond to his name. He began to hold his foster mother's gaze. He even started reaching out, not just for toys, but for her hand. The first time he said, "Mama," she wept. It was more than a word. It was a signal from deep inside a once closed world: I trust you. I'm ready to connect. Chapter 8. Trapped in Relationships: The Cost of Abuse and Neglect. What happens when the very people meant to protect you are the ones who cause harm? For many trauma survivors, especially children, abuse and neglect are not isolated events. They are the air they breathe, the shape of their world. This chapter explores how such early violations of safety and trust distort a child's development and sense of self in lasting, often invisible ways. At the core of this chapter is a harrowing emotional paradox. Children are biologically wired to seek comfort from caregivers, even when those caregivers are abusive. It's a tragic survival strategy, choosing attachment over safety, because abandonment feels more terrifying than pain. A child would rather believe I am bad than accept that their caregiver is dangerous. That belief becomes a shield. If I can just be better, quieter, and more obedient, maybe the pain will stop. We meet Monica, a teenage girl who was sexually abused by her stepfather for years. Her mother knew, but did nothing, turning away in silence. Monica, rather than being enraged at her abusers, blamed herself. She dressed in oversized clothes, avoided mirrors, and quietly suffered panic attacks. "It must have been my fault," she said during therapy, "because I never stopped him." This is the insidious cost of abuse, not just the physical violation, but the way it rewrites the internal story a person tells themselves. Children internalize shame, self-loathing, and helplessness. Their developing brains adapt by becoming hyperalert, scanning for danger, or emotionally shutting down to survive overwhelming fear. Studies show that such children often develop disorganized attachment styles, marked by confusion, fear, and inconsistent responses to affection. They may crave closeness but panic when it's offered. In school, they're labeled difficult, defiant, or withdrawn. Yet what they truly are is wounded. Deeply. The brain's threat detection system, especially the amygdala, becomes overactive, while the rational, soothing parts of the brain, like the medial prefrontal cortex, are underdeveloped. This neurological imbalance explains why survivors may overreact to small stressors or seem numb to major events. Their bodies are still bracing for trauma that has long passed. Dr. van der Kolk also explains that neglect, though less visible than physical abuse, can be just as devastating. A child left alone emotionally, who is rarely touched, spoken to, or seen, grows up unsure of their worth or even their existence. Without relational feedback, they don't learn to regulate emotions or recognize their own needs. One striking story is of Daniel, a young boy who had been severely neglected. When a teacher gently touched his shoulder to get his attention, he flinched violently, expecting harm. During therapy, when asked how he felt, he said, "I don't know what that means." He had never been asked before. Children like Monica and Daniel carry their trauma into adulthood. They may struggle with intimacy, self-image, or chronic health conditions rooted in prolonged stress. They may enter relationships that mirror the abuse they endured, believing, at some level, that pain is love. Yet this chapter is not without hope. Trauma-informed care that emphasizes safety, consistency, and compassion can help rewire these patterns. When survivors are believed, respected, and gently guided to understand that what happened was not their fault, the long process of healing begins. Therapies that incorporate body awareness, such as EMDR, yoga, or somatic experiencing, are especially effective because trauma is not just a memory, it's a body memory. Survivors must learn not only new thoughts but also a new felt sense of safety. By the end of the chapter, the message becomes clear: the cost of early abuse and neglect is immense, but healing is possible, not through quick fixes or forced forgiveness, but through deep, sustained connection, often one safe relationship at a time. Chapter 9. What's love got to do with it? Love is often seen as the cure for emotional pain. But for trauma survivors, especially those harmed by the very people who were supposed to love them, love can feel dangerous, confusing, or even impossible. This chapter explores a painful contradiction. Love, the most basic human need, becomes a source of fear for those who have been betrayed by it. Children who grow up in abusive or neglectful homes learn early that love can hurt, that closeness leads to danger. They grow up carrying an invisible scar, a deep-seated mistrust of connection. As adults, they may long for intimacy while pushing it away, trapped in a cycle of desire and fear. One story stands out. Laura, a woman in her 40s, struggled in every romantic relationship she had. Her partners often described her as distant, guarded, or overly reactive. In therapy, Laura revealed that she had been physically abused by both parents. As a child, she had learned to hide her emotions, to expect rejection, to flinch when someone reached out. So even when someone loved her genuinely, she didn't know how to receive it. "I want to be loved," she said, "but I can't believe it when it happens." The chapter dives into the science behind this emotional confusion. Love and attachment are regulated by complex systems in the brain, particularly the oxytocin and dopamine pathways, which are responsible for bonding and pleasure. When these systems are disrupted by early trauma, they don't simply reset in adulthood. In fact, the very chemicals that signal safety to most people can trigger fear and withdrawal in trauma survivors. Trauma also affects mirror neurons, the brain's mechanism for empathy and emotional attunement. These neurons allow us to feel with others, to recognize subtle cues in facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. But when a child grows up in a home where those cues signal threat, not safety, the mirror system can become dysregulated. Survivors might misinterpret kindness as manipulation or feel overwhelmed by others' emotions. Another painful truth emerges: many trauma survivors feel unworthy of love. Years of internalized blame, shame, and emotional abandonment create a belief that they are fundamentally broken or too much. In relationships, they may sabotage intimacy before it gets too close, afraid to be truly seen. Yet the chapter also reminds us, the ability to love and be loved is not lost, it is wounded. Healing begins with safe relationships where no one is rushing and where presence is consistent and non-judgmental. Therapeutic spaces become places where survivors learn, often for the first time, that they are lovable not because of what they do, but because of who they are. One small breakthrough can be life-changing. A gentle touch. A kind word. A therapist who listens without pushing. These become seeds of trust, slowly growing into the capacity for connection. So, what does love have to do with it? Everything. But for those wounded by love, the journey toward it is not a straight line. It is a tender, patient unfolding, a gradual rediscovery of what it means to feel safe in the arms of another human being. Chapter 10. Developmental Trauma, the Hidden Epidemic. Not all trauma is sudden or violent. Some of the most devastating forms unfold silently, day by day, year after year, in childhood homes filled with neglect, instability, and emotional absence. This is developmental trauma, a kind of injury to the very architecture of the growing brain, caused not by a single event but by chronic, relational failures during the most formative years of life. In this chapter, the hidden cost of such trauma is brought into sharp focus. Unlike a visible wound, developmental trauma doesn't always leave scars that others can see. These children may not have witnessed war or experienced a car crash, but they were raised in environments where emotional safety didn't exist. Parents may have been unpredictable, addicted, violent, emotionally cold, or completely absent. What they lacked wasn't just care, it was attunement, the feeling of being deeply seen and accepted. One poignant story illustrates this. Jason, a boy removed from a series of abusive foster homes, had trouble focusing, trusting adults, and managing his impulses. He had been labeled with ADHD, ODD, and conduct disorder. But what he truly suffered from was a lack of secure attachment. The moment-by-moment presence and soothing co-regulation that children need to build a stable sense of self had been denied him. Developmental trauma shapes the brain's wiring, particularly the stress response systems and areas related to self-regulation, emotional control, and memory. These children grow into adults who may struggle with relationships, decision-making, and self-worth. They often feel emotionally numb or constantly on edge, as if life is either too dull or overwhelmingly threatening. Perhaps most tragically, many of these individuals are misdiagnosed. Rather than seeing the root of their distress in early trauma, professionals may pathologize them with disorders like bipolar, borderline personality, or oppositional defiant disorder. The label sticks, but the pain remains untreated. The chapter calls for a paradigm shift. We must recognize developmental trauma as a public health crisis. It is not just a psychological issue, it is biological, neurological, and societal. Healing requires more than talk therapy. It calls for safe relationships, body-based interventions, and environments that restore trust. This chapter is a wake-up call. Not all wounds bleed. But they shape lives in ways that are just as deep, and just as deserving of compassion. Part 4. The Imprint of Trauma. Chapter 11. Uncovering Secrets. The Problem of Traumatic Memory. Trauma has a unique way of hiding itself. It doesn't always speak in words or appear in clear, chronological memories. Instead, it often lodges itself in the body, shows up in irrational reactions, or creeps into dreams and fragmented flashbacks. In this chapter, the haunting complexity of traumatic memory is explored, not as a simple recollection of the past, but as a deeply embedded emotional and sensory experience that refuses to be neatly stored. Unlike ordinary memories, which are processed and filed away in the brain's narrative centers, traumatic memories often bypass these pathways. They can become frozen in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, surfacing not as coherent stories but as raw, emotional fragments, sounds, smells, sensations, or images that hijack the body and mind without warning. This makes trauma survivors feel as though they are reliving the experience, not remembering it. We meet Sabrina, a soft-spoken woman who began therapy for anxiety and disassociation. She couldn't remember much of her childhood, but her body told a different story. Certain sounds would make her flinch. Sudden movements left her breathless. During a therapy session using guided imagery, she began trembling uncontrollably. Her hands clenched. Tears welled in her eyes. What emerged was a buried memory of being locked in a dark closet for hours as a child, a punishment she had long forgotten, yet one her body never did. This story reflects a key insight. Traumatic memories are not always accessible through rational thought. They are often stored in what researchers call implicit memory, the kind that doesn't rely on words. Survivors may feel shame, terror, or rage without understanding why, only to discover that their bodies are reacting to echoes of the past. The chapter also reveals how trauma can distort memory. Some survivors are haunted by images or voices that don't make sense to them. Others struggle with guilt over what they cannot remember. Sadly, the inability to recall events clearly has sometimes led to victims being doubted or dismissed, even in legal cases. But neuroscience has begun to affirm what survivors have long known: memory is not just a mental record, it's a physiological imprint. Uncovering these hidden memories is not about forcing the past into the light. It's about creating a safe, regulated space where the body can slowly release its grip on what it's been holding. Therapeutic techniques like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, somatic experiencing, and trauma-informed yoga are increasingly used to help access and reprocess implicit memory without re-traumatizing the individual. What emerges from this chapter is not just an understanding of how trauma changes memory, but a profound sense of compassion. Survivors are not broken, they are living with the unhealed imprints of experiences that were too overwhelming for the brain to process at the time. These memories may be buried, but they are never truly lost. Healing means inviting them back, not with fear, but with care. Chapter 12. The unbearable heaviness of remembering. Remembering can be both a path to healing and a gateway to pain. In this chapter, the focus shifts to what happens after traumatic memories begin to surface, when survivors are no longer living in total darkness but instead are faced with the vivid and painful weight of what actually happened. Trauma doesn't just hide, it builds pressure. Once memories start to return, they can crash like waves, unpredictable and intense. Survivors may relive the emotions, sensations, and fear as if the events are happening all over again. This phenomenon is known as re-experiencing, and it can be deeply destabilizing. The mind seeks order and explanation, but trauma resists easy understanding. Survivors often ask, "Why now?" or "What triggered this?" The chapter introduces us to Tom, a firefighter who had always prided himself on his courage. After responding to a horrific house fire where children were trapped inside, he began having nightmares, flashbacks, and violent outbursts. At first, he tried to suppress the memories, drinking, working longer hours, and avoiding sleep. But the harder he tried to push them down, the stronger they fought their way back. His body trembled at certain smells. His hands shook when he heard sirens. For people like Tom, remembering is not a gentle unfolding, it is a visceral storm. Trauma doesn't just live in the past, it shapes the present. And while remembering can lead to understanding, it must be done safely. Without support, survivors can become trapped between the numbness of avoidance and the overwhelm of intrusion. This is why trauma recovery is not just about talking, it's about timing, trust, and the slow reweaving of fragmented selves. In therapy, survivors must be allowed to pace their remembering. They must be grounded in the present before they reach into the past. Therapists are not just witnesses, they are co-regulators, helping people hold the weight of what they are beginning to see. But even with support, remembering can lead to grief. Survivors may mourn the childhood they never had, the trust they lost, the time spent disconnected from themselves. They may feel shame, guilt, or anger, not just at others, but at themselves for not remembering sooner. The healing journey, therefore, includes not just memory, but self-compassion. The chapter underscores that remembering is not about reliving, nor about remaining stuck in trauma. It's about reclaiming agency, the ability to say, "This happened to me, but it does not define me." It's about integrating the memory so it no longer controls the present. And it's about finding meaning, even if that meaning is simply survival. Trauma splits the self. Remembering, when done gently and safely, is how we begin to put the pieces back together. But the process is heavy, and it demands courage. Part 5, Paths to Recovery. Chapter 13, Healing from Trauma, Owning Yourself. Healing from trauma begins with reclaiming something most survivors lost long ago, a sense of ownership over their own body, mind, and experiences. In this powerful chapter, the journey towards self-possession takes center stage. It's not about forgetting or erasing what happened, but about regaining the ability to live without being ruled by the past. Trauma often leaves survivors feeling like strangers to themselves, disconnected, fragmented, and reactive. Emotions flare unexpectedly. Bodies flinch from invisible threats. Decisions are made from fear rather than intention. To heal, survivors must learn to reclaim their selfhood, to feel again that they have choices, that they are not helpless, and that their body is their own. We meet Marcia, a woman who survived years of sexual abuse in childhood. For decades, she moved through life mechanically, functioning, but never truly present. In therapy, the moment she first said, "I didn't deserve that," was a turning point. It marked the beginning of ownership, of her story, her pain, and most importantly, her voice. The chapter emphasizes that ownership begins with awareness. Survivors must learn to notice their internal states without judgment. What does the body feel like when it's anxious? What thoughts arise when safety feels threatened? These questions, asked gently, help begin the process of reconnecting the parts of the self that trauma severed. Van der Kolk explains that trauma survivors often struggle with dissociation, a disconnection from their feelings, sensations, and even their identities. One of the greatest hurdles is helping people feel safe enough to be present. Healing isn't possible until survivors can tolerate being in their own skin. The therapeutic path toward ownership varies for each individual. For some, it's talk therapy. For others, it's movement, art, breathwork, or EMDR. But the common thread is the development of a curious, compassionate inner observer, a voice that says, "What happened to me was not my fault. I'm allowed to feel. I deserve to heal." Healing is not linear. There are setbacks, regressions, and painful realizations. But ownership means showing up anyway. It means recognizing that the trauma happened to you, but it is not you. You are more than your wounds. You are the person who lived through them, and who is now strong enough to confront them. The chapter also stresses the importance of agency, the ability to make choices and act with intention. For trauma survivors, reclaiming agency may begin with something as simple as saying no and meaning it, or recognizing the right to rest, to set boundaries, or to tell their story when they are ready. The first act of healing is not forgetting, it's owning. And with ownership comes strength, clarity, and a renewed connection to life. Chapter 14, Language, Miracle and Tyranny. Language is a gift, a bridge between our inner world and others. It allows us to shape our experiences into stories, give voice to pain, and seek understanding. But for trauma survivors, language can be both a miracle and a barrier. In this chapter, the focus shifts to the role of language in processing trauma. Words can free, but they can also trap. Some traumatic experiences are so overwhelming that the brain's speech centers, like Broca's area, actually go offline during the event. This means that many survivors are left without words to describe what happened to them. Their pain is stored not in coherent memories but in sensations, images, and emotional fragments. This disconnect creates what Van der Kolk calls a speechless terror. Survivors often say, "I don't know how to talk about it," or "There are no words." In such cases, pushing for verbal storytelling too soon may lead to re-traumatization rather than healing. The miracle of language emerges when survivors begin to find the words that match their inner experience. This act of naming what once felt unspeakable can be profoundly liberating. One veteran, for example, finally found the strength to say aloud, "I was just a kid, I didn't know what I was doing." That sentence alone began to unravel years of guilt and shame. But the tyranny of language occurs when survivors are forced to use words that don't fit, or when they are expected to just talk it out, as if words alone could resolve what is deeply physiological and emotional. Talking about trauma is important, but only when the body and mind are ready. Kolk advocates for modalities that help people feel before they speak, like movement, art, or mindfulness. These allow the brain to reconnect in safety, so language becomes a tool for healing rather than avoidance or pressure. Ultimately, language can transform isolation into connection. But it must be handled gently, and with deep respect for what the survivor may not yet be ready to say. Chapter 15: Letting Go of the Past, EMDR. In this chapter, we are introduced to one of the most groundbreaking therapies in the treatment of trauma: eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. At first glance, EMDR can appear almost too simple. Patients follow a therapist's fingers back and forth with their eyes while recalling traumatic memories. But beneath this simplicity lies a powerful neurological mechanism for healing. The beauty of EMDR lies in its ability to bypass the rational brain, that part which often overanalyzes or gets stuck in loops of guilt and shame, and instead engage the parts of the brain where traumatic memories are stored in fragmented, emotional form. These memories aren't just remembered, they are reprocessed, often with surprising clarity and emotional release. One woman, a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, had spent years in therapy trying to talk through her pain with little success. During EMDR sessions, however, her body began to tremble, and tears came freely, not from words, but from an authentic, felt experience. She emerged from the process saying, "It's not mine to carry anymore." Unlike traditional talk therapy, EMDR does not require the patient to go into exhaustive detail or repeatedly relive their trauma. Instead, the therapist helps the client hold the memory in mind while the brain is gently nudged to integrate it, reducing its emotional intensity. For many survivors, this creates space for new beliefs to form, like, "I am safe now," or "It wasn't my fault." Kolk acknowledges that EMDR isn't a magic cure and doesn't work for everyone. But for those who respond to it, the transformation can be life-changing. It shifts trauma from a perpetual present into a manageable past. Most importantly, EMDR gives survivors something they may not have felt in years: a sense of control over their own story, and the peace that comes with letting go. Chapter 16: Learning to Inhabit Your Body, Yoga. For trauma survivors, the body can often feel like a battlefield, tense, unpredictable, and disconnected from safety. In this chapter, Kolk introduces yoga not as a form of exercise but as a vital therapeutic practice that helps survivors reclaim ownership of their bodies. Trauma doesn't just leave mental scars, it takes root in the nervous system, causing chronic tension, disrupted breathing, and a disconnection between mind and body. Survivors often live in a state of functional freeze, where their minds are alert but their bodies are locked in patterns of fear and defense. Yoga, with its slow, intentional movements and emphasis on breath, offers a gentle yet profound way to restore that lost connection. Kolk recounts stories of patients who, after years of talk therapy, found a different kind of healing through yoga. One woman who had suffered childhood abuse described how, during a quiet yoga pose, she was able to feel her body as her own, for the first time in decades. That moment of grounding and presence allowed her to weep, not from pain, but from relief. The chapter emphasizes that trauma is stored not just in memory, but in the body itself, in tight shoulders, clenched jaws, and shallow breaths. Yoga helps survivors begin to notice these physical responses with compassion rather than fear. Through consistent practice, they can learn to observe their bodies, regulate their breathing, and gradually regain a sense of control over their internal world. Importantly, yoga does not force memories or emotions to surface. Instead, it provides a safe container where survivors can begin to explore sensations without judgment. This bodily awareness, known as interoception, is a critical step in healing because it reconnects the survivor to the present moment and to themselves. Rather than fixing or forcing, yoga invites survivors to listen, to be still, to breathe, and perhaps most importantly, to recognize that they are more than their trauma. They are still whole, still here, and still capable of peace. Chapter 17: Putting the Pieces Together, Self-Leadership, IFS. In the realm of trauma recovery, one of the greatest challenges is the internal fragmentation that survivors often face. People feel as though different parts of themselves are in constant conflict. One part may want to forget the past, while another keeps reliving it. One may long for connection, while another fears vulnerability. In this chapter, van der Kolk introduces a groundbreaking approach to healing, internal family systems, IFS therapy, developed by Richard Schwartz. IFS is based on the idea that our personalities are made up of multiple parts, each with its own perspective, emotions, and desires. These parts are not signs of mental illness. They are normal aspects of the human psyche, often developed as coping mechanisms in response to trauma. Some parts act as protectors, shielding us from pain. Others carry the burden of past wounds, often manifesting as shame, fear, or rage. Through IFS, survivors learn to approach these inner parts with curiosity and compassion. The goal is not to get rid of them, but to listen to them and understand their roles. When these parts feel heard and respected, they begin to soften, and healing can begin. One powerful story shared in the chapter is that of a woman who had spent years struggling with self-harm. In IFS therapy, she discovered that this behavior came from a part of her that believed pain was the only way to survive. Instead of rejecting this part, she learned to speak to it, to thank it for trying to help, and then gently guided it to trust herself, to take over. Over time, that destructive behavior faded, replaced by a growing sense of internal harmony. At the core of IFS is the concept of the self, a calm, compassionate, confident inner presence that exists within everyone, no matter how wounded they may feel. As survivors develop access to their self, they become capable of leading their inner system with balance and kindness. Rather than being overwhelmed by trauma-driven parts, they can begin to understand and heal them. In this process, trauma survivors are not just managing symptoms, they're reclaiming their wholeness. The scattered fragments of the self are welcomed home, not with force, but with understanding. Chapter 18, Filling in the Holes, Creating Structures, PTSD. Trauma doesn't just wound, it often leaves gaping holes in a person's emotional and relational development. Survivors may never have learned how to soothe themselves, connect safely with others, or handle ordinary frustrations. In Chapter 18, Bessel van der Kolk introduces a therapeutic method designed to address these deficits head-on, the psychoeducational model for building secure bonds, PTSD. Unlike traditional talk therapy, PTSD focuses on building missing emotional structures through carefully designed group experiences. It acknowledges that many trauma survivors missed out on essential developmental experiences, such as being comforted as children, receiving consistent care, or feeling safe in a group. PTSD seeks to recreate those experiences in a controlled, emotionally safe environment, helping participants gain the skills and emotional awareness they were never given. The heart of PTSD lies in structured group interactions that foster trust, regulation, and connection. Participants engage in exercises that promote co-regulation, the experience of feeling calm and safe in the presence of others. This process allows individuals to slowly let down their guard and begin to rewire patterns of fear, isolation, and hypervigilance. One poignant story shared is of a man who had grown up in an abusive household and spent most of his adult life emotionally numb. In a PTSD group, he was encouraged to participate in a simple exercise, making eye contact while another person offered a statement of empathy and support. At first, it was unbearable. But over time, through repetition and gentle encouragement, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in decades: connection. That moment marked a turning point, not just in therapy, but in his ability to function in the real world. PTSD emphasizes that healing cannot happen in isolation. Humans are social beings, and our deepest wounds often come from broken relationships. Likewise, our most profound healing often arises through restorative human connection. By creating a safe space for people to practice new ways of relating, PTSD helps fill in the emotional holes left by trauma. It's not about fixing the past, it's about building what was never there. And in doing so, survivors can begin to experience what it truly means to feel whole, present, and alive in their bodies and in the world. Chapter 19, Rewiring the Brain, Neurofeedback. For many trauma survivors, the mind feels like a battlefield, a place of relentless hypervigilance, emotional shutdowns, or sudden waves of terror. Traditional talk therapy can provide relief, but some wounds are embedded so deeply in the nervous system that words alone cannot reach them. This chapter explores a promising frontier in trauma treatment, neurofeedback, a method that allows the brain to heal itself by learning its own rhythms. Neurofeedback, or e.g. biofeedback, is a non-invasive therapy that measures brainwave activity and helps individuals regulate it through real-time visual or auditory feedback. The person sits in front of a screen while sensors track brain activity. When their brain shifts toward more balanced, regulated patterns, like calm focus instead of chaos, the screen responds positively, reinforcing the shift. It's like giving the brain a mirror for the first time, letting it see where it's stuck and how to change. Bessel van der Kolk shares the story of a young girl who had endured early abuse and developed severe dissociation. She could barely concentrate or feel safe in her own body. After several sessions of neurofeedback, her teachers and caregivers began noticing subtle but profound changes: improved focus, better emotional regulation, and a newfound ability to stay grounded during stressful moments. Neurofeedback didn't erase her trauma, but it helped her brain find a more stable footing. This technique is especially powerful for those who feel trapped in reactive cycles, where any slight stressor triggers a flood of anxiety or shutdown. By guiding the brain into more regulated states, neurofeedback can lower emotional reactivity, improve sleep, and enhance mental clarity. But neurofeedback is not a magic fix. It requires time, consistency, and a skilled practitioner. And while it doesn't offer deep emotional insight like traditional therapy might, it lays the neurological foundation upon which other forms of healing can flourish. For many trauma survivors, it's the beginning of finally feeling safe inside their own minds. When the brain learns to quiet its alarms and find balance, the world itself begins to feel more predictable, and the body, once a battleground, can start to feel like home again. Chapter 20: Finding Your Voice, Communal Rhythms and Theater. Trauma silences. It isolates. It robs individuals of the ability to speak their truth, connect with others, or even recognize themselves. In this final chapter, the book turns to one of the most ancient and profoundly human tools of healing: communal rhythm and theater. Through music, movement, rhythm, and role-play, trauma survivors can access parts of themselves that words may never fully reach. Dr. van der Kolk shares powerful experiences from working with groups of traumatized young people who found healing not through clinical settings, but through drumming circles, theater workshops, and expressive arts. One young man, long withdrawn after severe childhood abuse, slowly began reconnecting with his emotions through acting. When he stepped into a character, he stepped out of his trauma, just long enough to feel something new: empowerment, empathy, even joy. Theater gave him a structure, a voice, and a community. These creative practices bypass the analytical brain and go straight to the body, where trauma lives. Drumming, for instance, helps regulate heartbeat and breathing. Group performance creates safety through shared expression. Theater allows participants to rewrite their narratives, express deep emotions, and witness others doing the same. The goal isn't to become an artist, it's to reclaim one's voice, agency, and place in the world. In rhythm and story, survivors find themselves not broken, but whole, and deeply human. Epilogue: Choices to be made. In the final reflection of The Body Keeps the Score, the author brings us to a crossroads, not just for trauma survivors, but for society as a whole. The message is clear: healing is possible, but it requires intentional choices in how we treat trauma, how we support one another, and how we structure our systems of care. Trauma is not an isolated wound. It ripples outward, affecting families, communities, and even entire nations. When ignored, it festers. When addressed with compassion, science, and creativity, healing can flourish. The epilogue reminds us that the greatest challenge is not understanding trauma but deciding what we do about it. We're faced with pivotal decisions. Do we continue to invest in systems that punish the symptoms of trauma, addiction, violence, emotional dysregulation? Or do we choose to foster programs that restore agency, rebuild trust, and reconnect individuals with their bodies and communities? The author highlights real-world examples, schools that prioritize emotional safety, justice systems that embrace restorative practices, and therapeutic innovations that empower survivors to participate actively in their recovery. These are not just case studies, they are blueprints for transformation. On a personal level, the choices are just as urgent. Survivors can choose, when ready, to take steps toward healing. These steps may be small, acknowledging pain, seeking support, or exploring therapies that resonate with their experiences. The process is never linear, and the destination is not perfection. The goal is integration, a life where trauma is part of one's story, but not its conclusion. In closing, the epilogue extends a quiet, powerful invitation to choose courage over avoidance, connection over isolation, and healing over silence. Because while trauma may shape us, it does not define us. And the choices we make, individually and collectively, can shape a future rooted in resilience, dignity, and hope. You've just journeyed through The Body Keeps the Score, a book that doesn't merely describe trauma but illuminates the human capacity to heal. If you've listened this far, you already know, healing is not only possible, it is within reach. Whether you are a survivor, a caregiver, a clinician, or simply someone striving to understand the invisible wounds carried by so many, this message is for you. You are not alone. Your story matters. Your pain is real. And most importantly, your healing is valid. This book reminds us that our bodies remember, but they can also recover. Through movement, voice, connection, and safe expression, the weight of trauma can loosen. The past may shape us, but it does not have to hold us hostage. So take a deep breath. Reflect. Reach out. Begin again. Every small step toward wholeness is an act of courage. If this audiobook summary helped you understand trauma better, please like, share, and subscribe to support more life-changing content like this. Let others know that hope and healing are possible. This isn't just a book, it's a lifeline. Let's pass it on.